When we use the word ego here, we're going to discuss it in terms of the exaggerated emphasis that each one of us places on our own perspective. The exaggerated emphasis that we place upon our own experiences, upon me and my. The ego's expressions can be broadly understood to be three. So we have the sense of I am supreme, I alone exist, and I am the doer. So the sense I am supreme is essentially a superiority complex. So whatever you have achieved in life, from that you develop an inflated, false and fragile sense of self-worth. So we feel that we are superior to others because we have achieved certain things. In the second expression we have I alone exist. So what that essentially means is that while each one of us has our own perspective, the ego disregards or isn't even aware that other perspectives exist. And so it says that whatever my perspective is, this is the standard by which all things are to be measured. If it fits into my perspective, it's good. If it doesn't fit into my perspective, it's bad or it's wrong. As a result, the ego views everything in the world in terms of how can this benefit me. So it views everything, every person, every environment or circumstance as being basically there to serve its own needs. In the third expression, I am the doer, again, what the ego does is that it privileges or absolutizes its own perspective in the sense that whatever we have achieved in life, we attribute the causes only to ourselves. This is what the ego does. So no doubt, in order to achieve anything in life, I must put in my own efforts, my own causes. But what the ego fails to do is to recognize that there have been an infinite number of causes that have come in from many different directions over a long period of time in order for that one outcome to take place or to arise. But we forget all of that. And the ego looks at what my input has been and forgets everybody else, and then again gains this inflated sense of self-worth that I have been responsible for achieving this. The ego is the barrier to our own sense of mental peace and to our own harmonious connection or relationship with others. So how does this work? So if we look at the first expression of ego, I am supreme. First and foremost, the moment we have an ego, we have to recognize that it is a partial representation of circumstances or of the reality. Take an example. There may be a half a dozen people in one room. Each person has their own individual perspective on that room. One person sees the north-facing wall, another person sees the west-facing wall, and so on. Nobody has an absolute perspective on what that room looks like. Everybody has a snapshot from their own perspective. Each one has a partial representation of that room. So no one can claim that their perspective is absolute. And yet this is exactly what the ego does. We have our own values. We have our own sense of right and wrong, morality and ethics. We have our own views on who we are as a species or as an individual, what the world is like, how it functions. Each one of us is different. The problem is not indifference. The problem is that each one of us privileges our own perspective. What that means is that even though my perspective on the world is a partial representation of the reality, I treat it as if it were an accurate representation of reality. This sets us up for disappointment. If I expect the world or if I expect life to flow in a particular way, I will be disappointed if that expectation is based upon a wrong understanding or a partial understanding. So the ego's inability to view things from a much broader, more universal perspective sets up unrealistic expectations. When those expectations are unmet, we experience stress and disappointment. The expression "I alone exist" is very similar. We carry with us a perspective and expect everything to cater to that perspective, but the world will not. And when the world doesn't, we're similarly frustrated and disappointed. Another way that the ego disrupts our own sense of subjective well-being is through the formation of egocentric desires. So from the ego, from this particular perspective, from this emphasis upon our own physical, emotional and intellectual experiences, we develop demands to cater to the physical, emotional and intellectual aspects of our personality. We want perceptions, emotions and ideas that satisfy us. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but when the ego's desires get out of control, a number of things happen. First of all, we have to recognize that unfulfilled desire is the definition of stress. Think about it. If there is something that I want and I do not have, what is that state like? Now, if the desire is somewhat controlled, it's okay. Then it becomes a driving force for progress. But if that desire remains uncontrolled, we fall into a sense of agitation and craving. I must have, I must have. The mind constantly runs with the thought of acquiring and enjoying the object of desire. This is frustration. This is mental agitation. Not only that, but the desires modify into egocentric emotions. So I may have a desire for something. The moment I look at those who have that thing compared to me, I get envious. The moment someone gets in my way, gets in the way of me acquiring that object, I become angry at that person. So my anger then is a deflection of my desire. Once I get the object, I'm afraid of losing it, and I have a sense of superiority or arrogance towards those who have less. So all of these disturbing, unpleasant, negative emotions invade the personality when the ego's desires remain uncontrolled. How does the ego disrupt our relationships? Fundamentally, we need to recognize that the ego is a sense of separation. If I can only focus on my own experiences, if the only perspective I'm capable of adopting is my own physical, emotional and intellectual experiences, I have no resources available to think of yours. What do you need? What are you going through? Are you suffering? Are you happy? Are you confused? What can I do to make this person's experience enhanced? Now, I can't ask these questions, and I certainly can't answer them if the focus of my attention is only on my own experience. So then there is this separation. I don't know you. I'm not connecting with you. There's no empathy. There's no compassion. When there is this gulf between two people, the relationship deteriorates. Fundamentally, the ego is repellent. When we see someone who is sporting a very strong ego, I know everything, I'm better than everybody else, you have to serve me, I have a sense of entitlement, I deserve this. When we see someone functioning in that way, what is the natural psychological response in us? Keep away. We don't want to be anywhere near that. Look at the opposite, a young child. Now the young child has no ego. There's no calculation on her or his part trying to get something from others. It's guileless. And how do we react when we see that absolute lack of ego, absolute lack of inhibition? We're drawn to it. So where we see selflessness, egolessness, we are naturally drawn into that. Where we see ego, we are naturally repelled. So then what is the best way to deal with the ego? Fundamentally, knowledge is power. We have to understand what the ego is, how it functions, and then be able to spot it within the personality. This is crucial. Then we have to recognize the harmful effects of the ego. Once we have understood what the ego is and how it harms our own definition of peace and our own definition of successful relationships, only then will we be inspired to overcome it. So this knowledge is of primary importance. Once we've understood the need to manage our ego properly, it becomes a matter of implementing various disciplines. So a human being comprises three fundamental aspects: a physical body, a mind which is full of emotions, and an intellect which has the capacity to think, reason, judge, decide, discriminate. Each of the functions of the three aspects is given a particular mode of functioning. So if the ego is the concentrated attention upon me and my experiences, the antidote is to shift the focus of our attention. And this is crucial. Only a human being has the capacity to choose the focus of their attention. This is the freedom that we enjoy. Wherever our mind is dwelling, once we become aware that it is dwelling there, we have the choice to continue it or to shift it somewhere else. We have the ability to shift our attention from our egocentric perspective to a less egocentric perspective, to a wider perspective. So how does this work practically? If the ego constantly thinks about its own experiences, what is happening to me? What do I want? What do I need? What am I entitled to? How will this affect me? Then all we need to do to overcome this or to manage it is to inject into our awareness the thought, what is happening there? What is happening with the other? What is it like from their perspective? What can I offer the situation? By changing the focus, what happens is that we shake ourselves out of our current egocentric perspective and adopt a more universal perspective. So for the physical body, we act in a particular way. The physical body is always acting. From the moment we get up in the morning until the time that we retire in the evening, the body is engaged in constant action. The question is, from where is that action emanating? Is it acting from the egocentric perspective of my perceptions, emotions and thoughts, the things that I can get from this action? Or is it acting from a wider perspective? When the individual chooses to consider a wider perspective than his or her own, we say that the person is acting towards an ideal. So an ideal then is a goal or a result whose benefit lies outside my current egocentric perspective. It benefits a wider community. And so I pitch up the idea of serving the community in some way. And it can be anything. How we serve, what we do is irrelevant. The only thing that is relevant is the attitude that we consciously adopt. There's a line in the poem by John Milton on his blindness. He also serves who only stands and waits. So even if you're only standing and waiting and doing nothing, if you have that attitude of waiting to serve where you can, that is the essence of the discipline for the physical body. The discipline for the mind is to drop the egocentric feeling of I know it all. Now this is something that we all carry around with us, but most of us are unfamiliar with. Whether we know it or not, when the ego remains unattended, we immediately adopt the perspective of I know. And it may not be a conscious thought, I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm thinking, I know that I'm right. It's perhaps more of a tacit assumption below the threshold of our conscious awareness, but nonetheless we are still functioning in that way. So if we have that feeling of I know, what is the antidote? I don't know. So this is what we call surrender or devotion. How do we elicit this particular feeling? Is by examining the crevices in our own knowledge. What is it that we really know for certain? What is it that we can be absolutely sure of? Start to investigate some of the more fundamental questions about our existence. How is the physical body maintained? How is the natural environment maintained? What are the physical laws, the natural laws that are meticulously functioning to keep it the way it is? So how is this feeling of surrender elicited? It's by examining the crevices in our own knowledge. What is it that we really know for certain? What is it that we can claim to know about our existence and our experience? How does nature function meticulously to keep everything in a harmonious balance, no matter how hard we try to disrupt it? What's the cause of these natural laws? Is there an ordainer? Is there something which keeps them functioning? How did we come into existence? Why is there something instead of nothing? We look around us and we see a full manifestation from the microscopic through to the cosmic. How did it come about? Where's it going? Does it end? When we look at these questions, we begin to recognize the ignorance under which we are all functioning. The intellect's clear recognition of the periphery of our knowledge and the area of our ignorance elicits in us a profound sense of devotion or surrender. The mind drops that sense of I know it all and instead has the humility to say, I don't know. So the essence of surrender is the effacement of the ego. For the intellect, we have to remember that the ego is essentially a misrepresentation of the reality. It's an understanding of how the world works, but it's a partial understanding. It's not fully accurate. We have a huge number of unquestioned assumptions about who we are, how we function, how life works, what's right, what's wrong. For the intellect, we question. We must question every assumption that we hold, most specifically the ones that we're currently unaware that we do hold. To aid us in this discovery, we have certain fundamental principles that have been elucidated by philosophers and great thinkers for millennia. So we take the information that others have provided us and we reflect upon these fundamental principles. We look at them for ourselves and try to see the truth in them or not. The process of reflecting upon these ideas strengthens our intellectual acuity. It gives us the ability to penetrate more deeply into the nature of who we are and how life functions. As a result, this rehabilitates our knowledge base. We discard old assumptions which we now find to be false, and we take up new ones which are more accurate, a greater representation of the truth. As we function on a more accurate representation of the truth, our limited, constricted view of life falls away. The ego's limited, partial perspective is transformed into a less egocentric, more universal perspective.